So the next presenter will be yours truly. I will be talking a little bit, about, I'll be talking about the evolution of Pan-Africanism as a consciousness and as a movement. Today, I think what is at the center of a discourse in Africa is about unity. Can Africa speak with one voice? Can Africa, especially these issues mentioned by Professor Njoku, issues relating to the entry of China, the entry of Russia, and also the way the EU's having taken so much money from Africa, with the way they are maybe standing aloof today. And what about the United States? Can African countries speak with one voice? Can we get them to begin to speak? Is it the problem the new AU, or there are other internal dynamics that we still need to figure out? Because Pan-Africanism, when it was formalized, was about, it centered more on African unity. It centered more on trying to get Africans to speak with one voice. So to what extent has the Pan-Africanism achieved that? But that's something that my other colleagues are going to also look into, because mine is to set the stage for how this movement, how this Pan-Africanism, how it all came about, the evolution of it as a consciousness or as a movement. To start with, the concept itself of Pan-Africanism does not lend itself to a single or all-embracing definition. But for our purpose, we can see it as either as an ideology, or we see it as a consciousness, or we see it as a movement. It has three major elements when we are talking about Pan-Africanism. The first element is that of consciousness, the feeling of that consciousness among peoples of African descent about shared African heritage. The second part is the obligation of peoples of African descent to work for the interest of one another. And we also have a third element, which is advocacy for freedom, as well as political and economic unity or union of indigenous peoples of Africa. While the first two elements I mentioned here about shared heritage manifest mostly among Africans in diaspora, the third element, which deals with unity and freedom, or so manifests more within the continent. But where and how did this concept of Pan-Africanism originate? Where did it begin? There's quite a bit of controversy about where Pan-Africanism began. In other words, the origin of it. But most scholars believe that whether one views the Pan-Africanist movement as a consciousness, as an ideology, or as a movement, it definitely did not originate in Africa. It originates somewhere else. And the beginning can be traced to the New World. The New World here, I mean, in the United States and in the West Indies, and including Brazil, where we had so many people of African descent sold into slavery. So it was among them. It was because they have been there, having been there, they lost their language, they lost their culture, they lost their identities. And it was in an effort to reclaim or reconnect with these identities that Pan-Africanist thought and consciousness emanated. It was from among them, because they've lost much of what made them African. So we also do know that upon their landing in the New World in the 1600s, these Africans began to exhibit the earliest signs of Pan-Africanism. In other words, they became united by their common color, by their African, color, and also by their heritage, and also common suffering. They became united by all those. And many of them sought to return back to Africa. So that yearning and desire to return back to Africa was the earliest form of Pan-Africanism. Now, we can also say that although they never used that term, even when they were doing this in 1600 through 1800s, they never used the term Pan-Africanism. In fact, even when this American Martin Delany, who was a Black American, when he visited Africa, it was in about 1861. After his visit to Africa, he stated that he described Africa as our fatherland. This is an African American, visited Africa, came back to America, and was describing Africa as our fatherland. And he argued that the renewal of Africa required the development of a national character. These were his words. It required the development of a national character. What was he talking about? An African American visiting Africa, talking about fatherland, talking about national character. That is a unity he was talking about. Now, he also proposed a formula they call Africa for the African race and Black men to rule them. That's also his ideas. His ideas, were certainly Pan-Africanist, just as those of his contemporaries, such as Alexander Cromwell, and also Edward Blyden. In fact, there was also James Hutton. They were all in this together. Their collective thought about what they were feeling, about who they were, about their Africanness, were earliest formulation of things that were trying to connect them to their fatherland. Yet, when you look at Pan-Africanism, when you talk about Pan-Africanism as an organized movement, some analysts argue that Pan-Africanism began in 1900, and not like in 1600 or 1800 when these ideas were already being formulated. That it started in 1900. Why do they say so? It was all in 1900 that the West Indian law attorney who was practicing in London, it was barrister Henry Sylvester Williams. It was in 1900 that he convened the first meeting of the Pan-Africanist movement in London. And so that's the beginning of Pan-Africanism as an organized body. And there later he was joined by the Black American intellectual, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and also joined later by people like Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, and the rest of them. There were some Africans involved in this first meeting of 1900. But then, anyway, it took only just 1 year after Henry Sylvester Williams died. He passed on, and the leadership of Pan-Africanism globally was passed on to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, of the American Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was, in fact, he led that movement for about 45 years. But again, when you look at what we're talking about here, the African Americans themselves, right from beginning, though they were fighting for their own liberation within America, they are fighting for against racial discrimination within America, they did not lose sight of what was happening in Africa, their motherland, their fatherland, as described by Delany. Now, in order to, because they saw that, they heard exactly what happened at the Berlin Conference in 1885, when the Europeans took it as a matter of right to partition Africa and shared Africa among themselves. African Americans were fuming because many of them by then had produced intellectuals, such as Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. because he had already gained his PhD at the time that Africa was being partitioned. So he was so furious. And so they, on the one hand, they were trying to rescue themselves from racial discrimination and all that in America. On the other hand, too, they were also trying to speak against European predatory kind of activity in Africa. So you can see Pan-Africanism then having what I call a dual agenda, double agenda. But then it just, you know, the white, they were calling for the white Americans to give them more rights and all that. They were on the same hand, on the other hand, also calling on Europeans to let go their stranglehold on Africa as early as 1900. They had started to make that call. There were several meetings of a Pan-Africanist movement. There was one in 1919, immediately after the end of First World War, when the victorious allies wanted to repartition or redistribute the former German colonies. Pan-Africanist movement, this body, were vehemently opposed to that. They criticized that as a bad idea, that instead of them to start living Africans, why should they be, you know, redistributing Africa for colonization? That led to what they call the dual mandate or whatever they gave them. Anyway, moving forward, you know, without boring you here, the main conference of a Pan-Africanist movement occurred in 1945. That was a few years after Italian second invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. That invasion sparked it's just so criticized by so many Africans all over the world. Then the 1945 convention, by then World War II had ended. 1945 convention in Manchester was almost all about African freedom. Almost American racial discrimination and so on was now on the back burner, and African freedom, because of what they saw in Italy, because of what African Americans and also Africans in diaspora saw, the ravaging action of Italy and Ethiopia, unprovoked attack, and that was the reason why the Pan-Africanist meeting in Manchester in 1945 was all centered on Africa. Kwame Nkrumah was there. And also Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta was there at that meeting too, and some other African students. And then that was when the Pan-Africanists, W.E. Du Bois, George Padmore, and the rest of them from the West Indies and from America charged their African contemporaries and say, you go home now. We don't live in Africa. You live there. Go home now and take charge. We want you to fight for your freedom. We want you to do so that we can go back to the US and so on and face the civil rights movement that was also going on. So now that you have become educated, that was when Kwame Nkrumah said that it is on now. He left Manchester, left England, and returned to Ghana. And what happened? He began to push in a way that nobody knew was. The British thought that they were, you know, playing with somebody who, no, Kwame Nkrumah was just more than that. He has seen the Pan-Africanists in its making, and he has seen it all, and he was ready to push Ghana to its freedom, and was able to do so. But again, Pan-Africanism by 1960 had almost helped to achieve Africa's independence, but there was another aspect of it that was still hanging in the balance, the question of African unity. And that was what, when Kwame Nkrumah again advocated for the formation that when you get your independence, join the union. They had the Ghana-Guinea Union, so he was waiting for all other countries to get their independence and join the union, so that we will have what he called the United States of Africa, maybe 2 USAs. one in USA, one in Africa. But that didn't work because there were more conservative groups such as Nigeria and some others who opposed that whole concept of United States of Africa. Because of course, as Africans, you know that they were already thinking who will be the president of this new body. Will it be Kwame Nkrumah or so? So that frustrated the effort. And that's why when you hear about the Casablanca and the Monrovia group, the radical and the conservative, but at the end of the day, the conservative won the day by forming the Organization of African Unity, AU, that now changed to AU, a very conservative group that some are still thinking whether it is a toothless bulldog, because it still hasn't led us to anywhere. So in conclusion, in summing this up, so that I don't dominate the conversation, you know, although Pan-Africanist movement recorded many victories, as we have seen, it still faces many challenges today. The goal of African unity still hangs in a balance, just as the vestiges of racial discrimination against Blacks in the United States has continued till date. I guess the struggle continues. I will leave it here about the evolution. I will just leave it here, and then we will take some questions, you know, from you later.